Good morning, everybody. So what I'm going to do in this video is just quickly take you through how to answer this question that you're looking at here. It's the question from the 2020 paper. The socialists posed the greatest challenge to Bismarck's political authority in the years 1871 to 79. How far do you agree with this statement? Now, this is obviously the question that you sat in your Year 12 examination. And the purpose here is to work on a self-evaluation. By this point, you will have got your marked essay back and you'll have seen the feedback, and so it's learning about how you could have approached it differently from perhaps the way you did. Okay, so obviously the first thing, remember, always is that crucial stage of question analysis. And with this particular question, I actually couldn't think of a better example of what I've taught to you, and you've had a separate lesson on this. I call it the WXYZ approach to planning, where you identify the topic, okay, and the topic of the question it's about the challenges that were posed to Bismarck's political authority. Okay, that's what the question is about ultimately, and you're given the proposition that the greatest challenge, or the greatest political challenge, were the socialists, and that's your building block X, and building block Y then is you turn it round and you challenge the proposition. In other words, the socialists were not a challenge. Okay, and then the final building block is you say, well, there were other challenges. In other words, you present an alternative proposition. So if you just remember those sort of key points, the topic is first, then the supporting argument, that's the second building block. The third building block is the challenging argument, and the fourth building block is the alternative argument. And usually you can make the first one, the way you actually identify what the topic is, you deal with that in your introduction. Okay. A couple of other points about the question analysis. Notice that the question is about challenges to Bismarck's political authority. Okay, that's important. It's about political authority. So I made the point there that emphasis on the word political. Clearly, this is expecting you to show knowledge about the difficulties that Bismarck encountered passing laws through the Reichstag. When we're talking about politics, and it's largely about government, it's about how laws were passed. So you need to really engage with that, and that means you've got to show knowledge about the Reichstag and about the law-making process. In other words, about the different political parties at different times, the different election results, and how Bismarck needed to cultivate support from different parties in order to pass laws. Certainly in terms of general feedback, and you've got to ask whether this applied for you, that I think would be probably the biggest overall weakness, is that the supporting detail in your essay, you've got to ask yourself, was it precise enough? Were you really using precise knowledge to answer this particular question? Because that's what A-level is about. You've got to apply precise knowledge, and hopefully you'll see that in this video as I sort of take you through the sort of key points. And the other one, of course, is remember that the question is about 1871 to 79. Hugely important. Although there's possibly a slight valid justification to go slightly into the 1880s, and we'll get to that in a moment, keep your answer very much focused on the 1870s. And remember, 1871 to 79 covers 10 years. So you've got to really be precise in dealing with that timeline. Talk about the change. Change happened over that period of time. There was change. Okay, so you've got to be very, very sharp. Lots of dates should appear in your answer, okay, to sort of get that across. Okay, so again, it keeps coming back to precise information, okay, precise supporting information. Okay, so my starting point, and I don't need to, usually in lessons I give you one of these, but I would grab a bit of paper now, okay, you might want to stick 2 sheets of A4 together, and quickly sketch out that starting point for a mind map in the middle of your piece of paper. And then as I go through this video, what you want to do then is map out, okay, around the edge the sort of different points, okay? And you know the principles of mind mapping. So, if you don't have enough space and you've sort of mapped out at different points, then you may want to sort of do sub-branches off particular points, okay? But try to capture the sort of points onto a mind map, okay? And again, I would suggest to you that when you're sitting in an examination, although you don't have that much time to brainstorm and plan an answer, again, a quick mind map is a useful way of getting your mind working, because that's what you've got to do. You can't start writing your answer until you've worked out what the building blocks are, okay, and what sort of detail will sort of sit behind those building blocks. So a quick glance at that mind map there, you're looking at it, is the WXYZ approach. I mean, as I say, I think your topic, W, could be your introduction, okay? There's X, support the proposition. There's Y, challenge the proposition. There's Z, other challenges. And then, of course, a conclusion separate at the end. Okay, so let's just now go through. My introduction, I'm not going to read this through to you. You can pause the video and just read it yourself. But I think the key thing here, as I say, is about the topic. Okay, the question is about challenges to Bismarck's political authority. Okay, so what you've really got to make clear is that the new Germany, the imperial constitution, required the Chancellor needed to have majority support in the Reichstag, the lower house of parliament, in order to pass imperial legislation, in order to pass laws, and secondly, to secure approval of the military expenditure. So it basically meant that Bismarck had to keep a very close eye on the number of seats held by different political parties, and that changed over time. And obviously in the early 1870s, the National Liberals held most seats. Catholic Centre Party emerged as the second largest party, but the balance did shift, and throughout the 1870s the National Liberals did lose support. Catholic Centre Party were more of a constant, but to pass laws, Bismarck needed to look at those, and he needed to form alliances. He needed to cultivate support of different parties, and sitting beneath this is the constant growth of the socialists. They were very small at the beginning of the 1870s, but they were growing by the end of the 1870s, and Bismarck was aware of that, and he saw that as a threat, and that sort of had an impact on the way in which he had to work within the Reichstag. So and his tactical alliances within the Reichstag changed as a result of that. So read that introduction. I mean, that is not an introduction that I've written there. It's telling you what I would have put in an introduction, but that's the sort of key point. So have a look at that. Okay, so let's take the key building blocks, okay, and I'm using different colours for each. So that first building block then is you're presenting a supporting argument that the socialists did pose a challenge to Bismarck's political authority, okay. So I think I've got about 9 different points here for this, okay, and the first one is that the socialists had a political will to overthrow the Second Reich, the empire, and that made them dangerous. They had a political will to do that, okay. So in 1875, before 1875, there were 2 branches of the socialists. There was the ADAV and there was the SDAP. But the point is they united in 1875 to form the SPD, and their declared purpose at the Gotha conference was to overthrow the existing order. I mean, that's ultimately what they wanted to do, to create a socialist state and overthrow the existing order. So that was a big threat to Bismarck and the Second Empire. Okay, and the SPD agenda was very radical. It was extreme. It was to abolish capitalism. It was to nationalise and bring about state ownership of banks, coal mines, and private industry, and that in itself completely challenged and undermined the basics of what Bismarck and his social class personally believed, that wealth should be owned by the the wealth of the nation should not be sort of distributed and spread equally amongst the people. It should be owned by the upper and middle classes. So that's our first point. Second point, Bismarck perceived the SPD as a threat because they were very, very organised and they had a lot of organisational support from abroad. Okay, well, why was that? Because they were an internationalist organisation. They were an anti-capitalist organisation. Their ideology was Marxist. They were a sort of secular religion, and that was very different to Bismarck's own nationalist conservative ideology. And so he saw them as Reichsfeinde, okay, enemies of the Reich. And for that reason, they were dangerous. And they did have a very, very effective propaganda apparatus supported from abroad. Now, that's the key point, because they were international. So the first International Working Men's Association, for example, gave them the backing, and it provided them with a revolutionary language, the talk of class warfare. Bebel, the founder of the original SPAD with Liebknecht, even went so far as to praise what happened in Paris in 1871. Basically, during the Franco-Prussian War, radical socialists took control over the capital of Paris and set up a sort of communistic state. It didn't last very long, only lasted 2 months. But Bebel, one of the leaders of the German SPD movement, declared that was a taste of things to come. And that was very, very threatening to Bismarck. Okay, a sort of declaration almost of war against the new German state, saying that, you know, we don't support it, and we support international socialism, and we're going to get support from abroad to overthrow the new Germany. And also, the German socialists had a network of organisations and activities, social, cultural, that kind of brought people together. The working classes sort of identified with that. And again, that was very, very undermining to Bismarck, who's just created this sort of new Germany. So that's the second point. Okay. Third point, Bismarck took it very seriously. Okay. So again, there's that reference to the short-lived Paris Commune of 1871. That was very threatening to Bismarck. Okay, he realised that, you know, during the Franco-Prussian War, French socialists had literally seized control of the capital city, Paris, for 2 months, and that would have sat in his mind. Could the German socialists do a similar thing? Okay, so that's another point. Then, of course, remember what we said about time. You know, there was changes over time, but certainly by the late 1870s and certainly in 1878, Bismarck's concerns about the German socialists increased further after 2 failed assassination attempts against the life of that should be Kaiser Wilhelm I, not second, my mistake. Okay, against Kaiser Wilhelm I's life. People at the time saw these assassination attempts, again, it just kind of like justified it as it was an international plot against monarchs. These socialists were dangerous international terrorists. So, for example, in Russia, there were frequent attempts against the Russian Tsar in the late 1870s, and eventually they succeeded, with the Russian Tsar being assassinated in 1881. So again, that would have been sitting in Bismarck's mind, that these were organised terrorists who were plotting to overthrow the German nation. Okay. Next point, again, we're still on building block 1. The electoral support, this political wing of the socialists, the SPD, were winning more votes, and that worried Bismarck. So every time there was a Reichstag election, their representative party, the SPD, had leverage in the Reichstag. Remember, Bismarck needed majority support in the Reichstag to pass laws and to, in particular, pass the military budget. So again, there's examples there. The SPD in 1871 were very small, only 2 seats, but by 1877 it had increased to 12 members in the Reichstag. That's still relatively small, but Bismarck could see that they were growing, and he felt threatened by that, particularly in conjunction with the assassination attempts. So the sort of like a multifaceted threat. It was partly violent on the streets, it was also within mainstream German politics. Next, that increased support for the SPD in the 1877 election. Bismarck would have asked, well, why are they increasing their support? And that was very much part of the fact. Remember, there was a recession in the mid-1870s, started in 1873. It was part of a worldwide recession that did increase unemployment amongst the working classes, and it raised awareness of their low exploited status. And of course, the fact then in 1878 Bismarck pushed through the Reichstag, and he did get them passed eventually, the anti-socialist laws following those two assassination attempts against the Kaiser. That is evidence that he did take the socialist threat seriously. And yeah, you are being asked here to provide evidence that Bismarck was threatened by them. Okay, so again, just make these points clearly. And likewise, we as historians look back and we can see that those anti-socialist laws of 1878 did fail to crush the socialist spirit. And that therefore shows that Bismarck's fears were justified, that they continued to campaign, and eventually the anti-socialist laws were lifted in 1890. Bismarck conceded that they were not working. And in 1890, in that year, the SPD vote increased to 35 seats. And as of course you know, eventually in 1912, they became the largest party in the Reichstag. So that again is evidence that Bismarck's fears socialists were genuine, there was justification for it. And so the final point in this first building block, I think to have a nice little quote. Carr speaks of how there was a sort of fortress mentality. The German socialists were not going to be defeated by these anti-socialist laws. They dug their heels in and they became even more radical and even more class conscious. They simply went underground, publishing leaflets from abroad, which they smuggled into Germany and distributed it amongst the factories. And so as we move into the 1880s and then beyond Bismarck into the 1890s and the 20th century, the socialists continued to grow. So that's the sort of like the first third of the essay. Lots of material that you could use to argue the other case. Now, the next building block is then to turn it around and say, well, actually, there is argument that they were not such a threat to Bismarck's political authority. So what are the key points? So the socialists were not as radical as Bismarck feared. Okay, they appeared to be radical. Yes, there were assassination attempts, but we do know at the Gotha conference when the SPD formed, although they had a radical aim to create a socialist state, they did very clearly say we want to do it legally. Okay, that we will use legal means to achieve this. And that also was a divisive point within the socialists, so hugely important. Remember how the SPD before 1875 was split, and they were divided into the reformists, the original organisation, known as the Lassallians, the General German Workers' Association. They were the reformist wing. They were very kind of like, they wanted to work within the system to persuade the Kaiser to bring about change. Okay, and they were Prussian and they were admirers of Bismarck. And then there was this more radical organisation formed in 1879. They were the Eisenachers, and they were actually not Prussian. They were very anti-Prussian in their attitudes. They came from a different part of Germany, based outside Prussia, and they were more staunchly Marxist. They were revolutionary. They took more seriously the fact we need to be on the streets and we need to use whatever means at our disposal to bring about socialism. Now, those two groups did combine in 1875 at the Gotha conference, and they did on the surface form a united front. But we can see as historians that underlying conflict between the reformist wing and the revolutionary wing continued to weaken the socialist movement. It never went away, and it continued all the way up until the 1930s. In 1933, when Hitler took power, one of the reasons he was able to take power was that the SPD were divided. They were too busy arguing amongst themselves. So that reformist versus revolutionary debate within the party weakened their ability to be a strong opposition political party, and so that's an important point. So sticking to this theme about they were not as much a challenge, Bismarck was able to use the assassination attempts against the Kaiser as an opportunity to turn popular opinion against the socialists. He was able to portray the socialists as traitors, as Vaterlandslers, as literally fellows without a fatherland. So Bismarck was very good at making capital out of the fact these socialists are traitors to the nation, and that worked. Okay, Bismarck got a lot of support, particularly for the middle classes, behind him. He was very astute with propaganda and getting his message across. So, for example, Bismarck made capital out of the fact that in 1871 Bebel and Liebknecht had actually declared allegiance to the French during the Franco-Prussian War, and that they had opposed the annexation of Alsace-Lorraine at the end of the Franco-Prussian War. So in the 1878 elections, the SPD, we can see this Bismarck's propaganda worked, because the SPD lost 200,000 votes, and they therefore lost 29 seats in the Reichstag, and that was a success for Bismarck. So I think that's again evidence the fact that they were, we've got to remember the fact that they were not always a threat to Bismarck. Bismarck was able to weaken them. So in the short term, the 1878 anti-socialist laws did cause the socialists difficulties. That's the point. Okay, so again, all socialist organisations were banned, 1,500 socialists were arrested, emergency powers to the police. Well, again, that's argument, that's evidence you could use to say that Bismarck actually was successful in weakening the socialists, so we shouldn't overestimate their threat. And we can also, with hindsight, see that, remember, in the 1880s, Bismarck actually took the steam out of the socialist anger by trying to kill them with kindness, what we call state socialism. He passed various laws that looked after the workers, and that those are the three key ones. And as a result, the working classes became more bound to the reformist wing of the SPD, and that's exactly what Bismarck wanted to happen. So again, that's argument that maybe the socialists were not such a great threat. They could easily be persuaded to support Bismarck, as long as Bismarck was seen to be looking after the workers who were their voters. And then finally, the third building block is there were other groups, okay? Because you're being asked, were the socialists the greatest challenge? And you spent 2/3 of the essay looking at argument and counter-argument. Now you need to move to an alternative argument. And of course, the argument here is that Bismarck was also afraid of Catholics. That's obviously a key one, as another obstacle to national unity. So it wasn't just the socialists, okay. So you need to, I think, in this final part of the essay, just to engage with that. The linking point is obviously the Catholics. Bismarck saw them as similar to the socialist threat, in particular because they were internationalists. We know about the syllabus of errors and the declaration of papal infallibility of Pope Pius IX, etc. And the Catholics, likewise, like the socialists, had political representation in the Reichstag through the Centre Party, and that gave them political leverage, which they could and did use against Bismarck. Now, the best example of that is in 1878, following the first assassination attempt against the Kaiser. Remember, there were two attempts. Bismarck tried to get an anti-socialist law passed through the Reichstag, but he failed. Okay, he couldn't get enough votes for it, and one of the parties that voted against it were the Catholic Centre Party, and that was a wake-up call to Bismarck. He realised, well, to get my anti-socialist law passed, actually I shouldn't be. I need to maybe rethink my policy against the Catholics. Now, of course, up until that point, Bismarck had been attacking the Catholics with the Kulturkampf, but he then realised that he needed to move to a different strategy, and so that's the kind of trigger that in the late 1870s to sort of like move away from the Kulturkampf and instead to cultivate the support of the Centre Party against the socialists. Okay, and the other point then, which is very much linked to this, it's the same really with the National Liberals. They were really important to Bismarck because they were the largest political party in the Reichstag. Now, they were losing seats, but again, a wake-up call in the 1878, when Bismarck was trying to get enough support in the Reichstag for his anti-socialist laws, after the first assassination attempt, when he had his first go at passing the laws through the Reichstag, the National Liberals voted against it. They said that the anti-socialist laws were depriving the workers of civil liberties and their right to express their views, and were gagging them basically, and that worried Bismarck. So he basically had dissolved the Reichstag. New elections were called. There was then a second assassination attempt on the Kaiser, but when the Reichstag reconvened, the National Liberals, Bismarck was able to win their support. Okay, so I think the National Liberals, they lost votes in that election, and that worried the National Liberals. But Bismarck was sort of like smart enough to realise, I need to sort of get them on my side, and so the National Liberals were more cooperative and backed the legislation on that second attempt. But again, it kind of like showed that there was another challenge to Bismarck. He needed to think about the National Liberals and about the Centre Party, and he couldn't just pass laws by himself. He needed to get support from other parties, and that was a political challenge. It wasn't just about socialists. Okay, so pull it all that together, there's the conclusion. Okay, I think a sensible conclusion would be to make the point that Bismarck was kind of like the master of what we call realpolitik. That's sort of like opportunism, playing with different parties in the Reichstag, turning what might be seen as political weakness into a strength. So the socialists were definitely a significant threat to Bismarck's authority, but arguably he overestimated the extent of their threat. And what Bismarck did do is he learned that actually he could turn the threat into an advantage, and he proved to be very adept, very smart at playing up popular fears and anger against the internationalist nature of the socialists. He was able to sort of like drum up popular support, particularly amongst the middle classes, against the socialists, and in the short term turn that to political advantage by winning the support of the Centre Party and the National Liberals. And he needed to do that in the late 1870s, of course, because in the late 1870s his policies were becoming more conservative and more right-wing as he moved towards protectionism and so on, those sorts of things that we've already talked about. Okay, that's it. I'll stop there. As I said, just a quick run through really that particular question. And so 45 minutes to write an answer to that. You're probably thinking, well, I couldn't get all of that down. Of course you couldn't. But the key thing is you've got to have those building blocks worked out in your head, and then pace yourself in the examination room while you're writing that answer and get those key points down as best you can. But remember, the balance there is we're pretty much saying that the main body of the answer, you can break it down into three parts, and the first two parts is all about the socialists. Okay, you're supporting the proposition that they were a threat in the first third. The middle third, you're turning it around and saying the socialists were not such a great threat, and then in the final third, sounds like a football match, but in the final third you're looking at alternative threats, in particular the Catholics and the National Liberals. But you're maintaining the balance of the essay. 2/3 of it is focused in on what we call the proposition. Okay, the proposition of the socialists. Okay, not the topic. The topic is the challenge to Bismarck's political authority. Hopefully that was useful to you. Don't hesitate to come back to me if you've got any questions. Best advice from me, for a genuinely aspirational advanced level history student over the summer holidays, sit down, have a go at that, and in timed conditions, and have a second rewrite, have another go at it. And if you want to hand that to me and get my feedback, please do. Thanks very much. I'll sign off now. Bye.